everyone. I'm Barbara Hamley. On January 20, we will celebrate and commemorate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. But do you know that January 21st is National Day of Racial Healing? Up next on Another View, some may say they are unlikely bedfellows, but the descendants of the plaintiffs and the judges in two landmark civil rights Supreme Court cases are now working together to heal the racial divide. And their work is bringing them here to Hampton Roads. How the law can perpetuate racism. It's an Another View history lesson, and it's coming up next, right after this news from NPR.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Hamley. We're happy that you're joining us on our new day, Thursdays at noon. And before we get started, there are so many opportunities for you to celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King and a racial day of healing coming up over the next couple of days. I'm only going to highlight a couple of the more well-known and larger events, but please check your calendars, find out what's going on in your communities, take your children, and celebrate the life and legacy of this man. So we want to start with the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Parade in Newport News. It is this coming Sunday, January the 19th at 1:30 p.m. It begins at New Beach Grove Baptist Church, and it ends at Manor Church. And so New Beach Grove Baptist Church, 361 Beachmont Drive in Newport News, and concludes at Manor Church, 326 Tabbs Lane. It starts at 1:30 on this Sunday, and everyone is welcome to come participate and march. And then Sunday evening, the City of Norfolk and the Virginia Symphony Orchestra bring their Songs for a Dreamer program. And this program is a part of the VSO's Harmony Project. It's a collaboration with 11 historically Black churches throughout Hampton Roads, which also provides the Virginia Symphony Orchestra musicians to perform during worship services, family night events, and education programs for youth and schools. The concert will be held at Booker T. Washington High School, located on Park Avenue in Norfolk. We will have more information about one of the composers for this particular concert later on in the show. You want to stay tuned. You will not believe this story that we're going to be bringing you. It is just absolutely fantastic. And then early on Monday morning, the 36th annual Martin Luther King Jr. Community Leaders Breakfast, sponsored by the Urban League of Hampton Roads. It's going to be from 8 until 9:30 a.m. at the Renaissance Portsmouth Norfolk Waterfront Hotel. That's on Water Street in Portsmouth, and tickets are available, and you can go to the Urban League of Hampton Roads website for more information. And then following the breakfast, the City of Norfolk is going to host its annual ceremony honoring Dr. King at the Addicts Theater at 1010 Church Street. The keynote speaker will be Reverend Dr. Yvonne Delk. And following the ceremony, then there will be a march to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial for a wreath-laying ceremony. So that's always something that's very moving. Bring your kids out and come and participate. On Monday evening, the Virginia Festival of Jewish Film is going to present Strange Fruit. This was a song performed by Billie Holiday, and it is a harrowing portrayal of the lynching of a Black man in the American South. And it actually started out as a poem written by a Jewish gentleman. And so it is Monday, January the 20th at 6 p.m. at the Susan S. Goode Fine and Performing Arts Center at Virginia Wesleyan University. That's on Wesleyan Drive in Virginia Beach. So go on over and check that out. And also the documentary We Cried Power. It is the story of the bold new social movement to end poverty in the United States, led by Reverend Dr. William J. Barber and Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris. And that is going to be shown at Coastal Virginia Unitarian Universalist, which is located at 809 South Military Highway in Virginia Beach. It starts at 7 p.m., and it also is free and open to the public. And then on to our topic for today, which is Dred Scott Presents Sons and Daughters of Reconciliation. Now, this is a panel discussion in honor of, the work that descendants of two civil rights cases and their judges, and how these people have come together to create racial harmony. And so they will be here in Norfolk at the L. Douglas Wilder Performing Arts Center at Norfolk State University. It is free. It is January 21st from 7 until 8:30 p.m. But you do need to register for this one. So you can call 622-7951-757, 622-7951 in order to register, or you can go online to the Hampton Roads Community Foundation, which is sponsoring this event. Go online to their website and find out more information there. So in 1846, Dred Scott, a slave, sued for his freedom. In 1857, the Supreme Court said no. In 1892, Homer Plessy, a black man, challenged separate accommodations for black and white railroad passengers. Again, the Supreme Court said no. Now the descendants of Scott and Plessy and the judges in the case, the descendants of the judges in the case, are working together to close the racial divide. Their discussion is coming to Norfolk on January 21st. You are invited to attend. It's called Dred Scott Presents Sons and Daughters of Reconciliation. And joining us to talk about it is Lynne M. Jackson, the great-granddaughter of Dred Scott. Hi, Lynne. How are you?
Hello, Barbara. I'm doing great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me today. And Henry Chambers, University of Richmond Law School professor and a member of the Governor's Commission to Examine Racial Inequity in Virginia Law. How are you doing, Hank?
Doing just fine. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you both so much for joining me. So, Lynne, I want to start with you because I really would love to know, how old were you, if you remember, when you first found out about your great-great-grandfather and the significance of what he did, and how was that passed down in your family?
Well, actually, the first time, or the first memory I have of it, is when I was probably about 5 years old, maybe 4 or 5.
Wow.
And there was a big court case reenactment where my dad was part of the program. He actually played Dred Scott. But he never spoke, and my dad was a great orator, and I was just waiting for him to say something. And he sat there the whole time, and I thought, what? So I didn't know then that slaves couldn't speak in court, so of course he had no lines. But it was a big deal. It was at night. There were a lot of people there, and there were cameras flashing, and so that was my. But
there you go.
That
okay,
is very much burned into my mind, the picture of that night. But
Wow.
Throughout the family, it's always been known. The connection to Dred Scott is not as distant as one might think, and so all of us have always known that we were related, and it was something I think that we understood was important when we were kids, and they told us that he was famous and he had this court case. But until I did my own personal studies, then it really became clear to me how much this meant.
Mm-hmm. So in an encapsulated form, because I cannot believe that there would be anyone listening who would not be familiar with the Dred Scott case, but can you just remind our listeners of what happened?
I said, don't put money on it.
I'm trying to be magnanimous here.
I try that all the time, but it's not their fault. If you're out there and you're one of those people, don't take it personally, because it wasn't taught. And you could pick any other case or history or whatever, and people aren't going to be experts on it. But that's why it's incumbent on us to do our own study.
Yeah.
You hear a name, go find out who that person is. But oh, no, I forgot your question.
So my question was, can you just give us an encapsulated
Yes.
overview of what happened?
That question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes, of course. All right. Well, the thumbnail version is that Dred Scott was, happy to say for you guys, born in Southampton, Virginia.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so he's a native there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm starting to feel like it's, very, very welcoming home, too.
Great.
Yeah, born there to Peter Blow and his family, Peter and Elizabeth Blow. they had 11 children, and that plays significantly into the story. But nonetheless, the story encapsulated is that at some point, Mr. Blow sold him, and that doctor that bought him took him into free territory. And in Missouri and in the 1807 law, it said once free, always free. But after they came back to St. Louis and the doctor died, Dred and Harriet, his wife, were not able to either get the freedom that they had actually received or were not able to purchase their freedom from the widow. And so in 1846, they did go and petition to sue her, and it took 5 court proceedings and 11 years to get to the Supreme Court to find out that they were never going to be released legally from slavery. But not only that, neither were any other persons of African descent who were slaves. And if you were an African descended person who had citizenship, you didn't have it anymore. If you were free, you could stay free, but you didn't have citizenship. It was stripped from them. So that was crazy. And they also kind of fiddled around with 2 other major laws that infuriated abolitionists and people who did not care for slavery. It was a catalyst for the Civil War. And in essence, we all know we won that war in the North, and therefore the amendments came about, 13, 14, and 15, that allowed us to no longer be slaves, to have citizenship, and to have the right to vote.
Henry, I can't even fathom. What did that mean? So if you were a freed Black, but you still had no citizenship rights, put that in context for us. What did that mean for them in terms of what it was like to live here?
Sure.
One more time, Henry.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
How are you doing?
Okay, much better. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm about to have a heart attack.
Well, we can't have that.
No, don't do that. Please don't do that to me.
No. So you make a good point about citizenship and free people and what that means. Part of the problem with Dred Scott is that the language that was used by the Chief Justice who wrote the opinion was so stark, because he recognized that there were Black folks in the United States and there were free Black folks in the United States. But his notion was that citizenship was a special status, a little different status. And he said, look, the people who are citizens are the people for whom the United States was founded, and that's not y'all. So his notion was, hey, you can wander around the United States, you can be here, but you're not really full citizens, full members of the society here. So you get whatever rights we decide to give you, not the rights that the Constitution says you have.
I can't even imagine what that was like back then. And then we'll talk more about some of the more current laws that also restrict movement and restrict our rights as citizens. It's just so interesting. So, Lynn, when you started the Dred Scott Presents, and I know that at the 160th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision, the judge, the descendant of the Judge Taney, and his full name is Charles Taney IV. He actually apologized to you for what the Judge Taney was the judge who wrote the decision, and so he actually apologized. Can you walk us through kind of your emotions and what that was like?
Well, okay, I'll try to do that. Charles, and it's pronounced Tawney.
Oh, Tawney, so I'm sorry. You know. Thank you.
Yeah, that's okay. No. Charles Tawney, Charlie. We had met before, and we knew that this day was coming, so we were prepared for that. But still, I'm always in awe of how much their family owns the story. And by that, I mean they do not try to excuse it or rationalize it or say, yeah, but, or any of that. Throughout their life, they've had discussions about it over the years when I didn't even know who they were, that they existed. And they were always contemplating about whether or not to do this. And so, as it turns out, fate would have it that it turned out that he would be the one who would actually take the mantle and say, you know, I think I can do this. it's not that they felt like they had to, but if it was helpful, he was willing to. And so I really felt gratitude for the fact that they were honest about it and willing to do that, and sorry, sorry in their own right, because they know the heinousness of it. So it was a poignant moment, but I was actually thrilled on the inside, because our foundation is about commemoration, education, and reconciliation. And what better way to show the spirit of that than to have the Tawney and Scott families working together?
Absolutely. Did he talk to you about the discussions that were held in his family in terms of how they accepted their descendant and what their descendant did?
It's a kind of a funny story. Every Thanksgiving, and they have a big family, they all kind of get together, and they would have this annual conversation. And some of them would say, the question was, should we apologize? And the question was answered by some, well, we don't really need to. I mean, we could, but we don't need to. And others would say, well, I think we really should. So it was just back and forth and back and forth. And one year, his daughter decided to do something about it. And she said, you guys have never come up with a conclusion here. I'm going to write a play about it. And so she did that. And that play is the vehicle around which God allowed us to actually meet.
Wow. That's incredible. And her play was about a fictional meeting of
Absolutely.
The two. Is that right?
Yeah, but a modern day descendant of Scott and Tawney that would meet and have a discussion. And it's very powerful and extremely well written. And you would wonder if you could see her. She's gorgeous and very young. And it's like, where did this come from? How do you have all that understanding and that emotion? How do you understand the Scott position so well? And she did. And so it was very well done. And hopefully it'll be available again in Virginia. We actually, I'm trying to think, I think we did do it in Virginia. No, I'm sorry, that was New York.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
But we've done it in New York and St. Louis. And forgive me if we did it in Virginia. I can't remember now. I've done too many things.
Well, you can do it again in Virginia. How about that?
We absolutely will. In fact, she's expanding it. So it was just about a 20-minute play, but she's doing a longer version. So I can't wait to see it, too.
So the same question to you about your family. What was the response? Or were there some that may have said, you know what, I don't want to hear it?
Well, those who don't want to hear it, I don't know. I did not hear from them.
Okay.
But we have every other year a Dred Scott Reconciliation Conference. And every year we have a Dred Scott Reconciliation Forum. The forum is not held in St. Louis. The conference is held here. And the first conference, we had our signature panel, and Charlie was there. And the apology issue came up in a beautiful way, and I had cousins who were there. And one of my cousins was just in rapt attention and literally in tears, because all of her life, I should say, it really was like, yeah, we know, and it didn't mean that much. But after we started the foundation and she saw how people were reacting, and she got to know it a little better, because, again, even as family members, everybody didn't quite understand the depth of the importance of it. Mm-hmm. But when she did become to understand that, and then came to St. Louis for this conference where Charlie was, and heard these conversations that were being had, not only with him, but with Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson Davis, and the Blow family that owned Dred Scott, we were all involved together in this process, and it just overwhelmed her. So I think when people really clear their minds and look at the reality of, who's involved and why they're involved, how they're involved, and now they're involved, it really is moving.
I remember reading that Charlie said that in class, when they would bring up the Dred Scott decision, that he would just kind of sit there like, I hope nobody makes a connection between my family, and what happened. Did you learn about Dred Scott in school, and what you learned if you did learn about it in school, was it what your family told you?
And I only have one remembrance of hearing it in school, honestly. And it was as though it always was. There was a slave named Dred Scott. He sued for his freedom. He lost. It started the Civil War. Then you turn the page. It's kind of like that was pretty much it. And that's why I kind of decided that I would listen to that little voice inside that said, you need to study this. You need to know this. But no, it wasn't taught. And that's why I said earlier on, for the people listening, don't feel bad if you don't understand these things, because it just wasn't out there for most people to get. But I'm happy to say that with my opportunities to travel and educate, share, and tell stories, I, for instance, have a class of fourth graders at this one school in West County here, that this will be my 8th year going to their school, and all the fourth grader classes come together, and we have a great time. Fourth grade is a wonderful age to absorb all of this. And they know more in that 1 hour that I talk to them than most of us learned in our whole lifetime.
Wow. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. We're talking with Lynne M. Jackson, who is the great-great-granddaughter of Dred Scott, the slave who sued for his freedom. And also with Henry Chambers, we call him Hank. He is a University of Richmond Law School professor and a member of the Governor's Commission to Examine Racial Inequity in Virginia Law. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. So, Hank, when you look back at the Dred Scott decision, and then you fast forward all the way through to where we are still here in 2020. Can you talk about, and this is a huge question, but can you talk about some of the residual effects to the African American community that the Dred Scott decision had that we still deal with today?
It is a big question. Part of the issue, I think, requires that we go back to sort of the Dred Scott decision or the ideas that were floating around at the time.
Okay.
One of the things that Lynn has noted is in many ways, folks today are embarrassed by what happened back then. And it's important to remember that back then, those views were not really that much of a surprise. So part of what we have to recognize is that we had a mindset in this country that worked on people for so long that today is a residual, or is the residual result of a lot of that mindset. Now, that's not to say that people today have the same mindset as folks had back then, but so much of the dollars and cents, so much of the structure of the United States was based on what had happened before, and was based on the concept of, gee, there are a group of people who simply don't deserve the same rights as others. You know, it's somewhat difficult for I think young people to recognize that that's how we were back then, and frankly, that's how we were not all that long ago. So part of what I ask folks to do is think about history a little bit and think about how the stuff that may have happened 150, 200 years ago is still in many ways related to what we have today. So let me give you an example. When we think about universities, we talk about universities' proud histories and how they've been around for a long, long time. Okay. Well, when they got started as institutions of higher learning, what were they teaching? You know, where did they get their labor from? What kind of society were they born into? And what kinds of deals did they have to make with the power structure at that time in order to be successful? Well, given all of those things, it's fair to say that some of what we're doing today is based on what happened a couple hundred years ago. So the position of minorities in society is related, today's position that minorities have in society is related to how folks have been treated for years and years and years and years and years, and how families have been treated or were treated for years and years and years, both families at the top, families in the middle, families at the bottom. Other pieces of puzzle that are important are our property ownership, for example. So if you consider free black Americans as well as enslaved people to be less than unable to buy property in some respects, unable to retain that property against people who wanted to buy it or take it from them, then there's no surprise that you don't necessarily have a grand number of people whose family has had property for hundreds of years the way that other families have. That's the kind of stuff that when we look today, we say, oh, that's actually no real surprise. If you treat folks as an underclass for hundreds of years, even once you say, oh, congratulations, you're free, it's not clear that those folks are going to be able to rise as quickly as others. Not to say that we're not much better off now than before. No one would deny that. But some of what we see in society today is clearly related to what went before and the ideas of the underclass that went before.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about the role of law in racial discrimination with Lynne M. Jackson, the great-great-granddaughter of Dred Scott, the slave who sued for his freedom, and Henry Chambers, professor of law at the University of Richmond and member of the Governor's Commission to Examine Racial Inequity in Virginia Law. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Kay joins us from Virginia Beach. Hi, Kay. You're on the air.
Oh, hi. Hi, Barbara. You're just doing a wonderful job.
Thank you.
I just hardly ever miss any of yours or Kathy's programs. It's just a great thing for this community. The reason I called is when I was a girl working at the airport, I think I'm one of the few people left on this planet alive who actually met Martin Luther King in person. And I was... it changed my life. It really did. I was working there with Ms. Brown, and old wonderful Goldie Goldstein was working there as a policeman, and we always knew when somebody important was coming in, and I went out and stood by the gate, the old airport, and I had a paper in my hand and a pen, and I was just standing there, and all these important men, were coming out with hats to meet him, and of course I knew one of them pretty well, and so I just stood there, and he came over to me, and he, I think he knew that I was just in awe of him and so forth, and he signed my, piece of paper, and he shook my hand. And I will never forget that handshake and what he said to me. He had a hand like the Pillsbury Doughboy. It was a wonderful hand, I can't tell you. And he said to me, we've got a lot of work to do. And I will never that changed my life. So I just had to share that.
Well, we thank you, Kay, for calling and sharing that. We really appreciate it. And thanks so much for listening. We appreciate you.
Bye-bye.
So bye-bye now. So Hank, I want to ask you something. In the context of, you got to remember what things were like back then, when laws were made and so forth. Do you think that it is incumbent upon us then to kind of go through and scrub the books every so often based on how things are today?
Yeah. I think we have to remember what came before, and let me be clear. When I think what you mean by scrub is the things that are in our law today need to reflect who we are today, even if we don't forget that they were there before.
Right.
So there's nothing we can do about the fact that Virginia had racially based, flat-out racist laws in the past. We can always and should always remember that. But the notion is, if those laws happen to be on the books, even if they're not being enforced or what have you, it's perfectly reasonable to say, we just want to take them out in order to say that, hey, in today's law, we don't want to have remnants of that in current law, even if it's not actually being enforced. But absolutely, I think we always need to remember what was there and recognize, hey, this used to be the law of Virginia. This used to be how we treated one another, or at least how some people treated other people. That's something we absolutely have to remember.
So you're working with this commission. I assume this is part of the work that you all do. So can you talk about some of the other laws that we have here in Virginia, for example, that that you would say, these laws need to go. These are no longer applicable?
Well, let's say here's part of what's going on is we have taken a look at the acts of assembly. So they're actions of the General Assembly that the General Assembly did and have laid down. So what we tried to do was go through those largely, at least certain time periods, and say, okay, here are a number of acts of assembly that are still sitting here that are in the law. They're not being enforced necessarily, but they're in the law, and we want to highlight them and say, hey, we probably ought to go ahead and officially repudiate the fact that they were there. So whether you're talking about laws related to massive resistance, whether you're talking about laws that related to separate mental institutions for folks of color and folks not of color, those are the kinds of things that we wanted to go back, look at, and say, well, okay, may not be being enforced, but they're still technically on the books. Let's just make sure that we make it clear to future generations that we repudiated these things as of this time.
So when you say repudiate, does that mean that they actually are taken off the books, that they're no longer a law, or does that just mean that we're acknowledging that we don't function that way anymore?
Both. We certainly acknowledge that we don't function that way anymore, and then sort of moving forward, when we talk about the acts of assembly, it is an action that was taken that is now being officially repudiated by government. That's the notion if the General Assembly acts on the suggested list of acts of assembly that have been noted.
Okay. Freddie joins us from Suffolk. I'm sorry. Hi, Freddie. You're on the air.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
What's your question or comment?
I was calling because I was listening to Ms. Jackson talk about Dred Scott, and I just learned a little bit more about him when I was in St. Louis and went inside the old St. Louis courthouse building there. And right outside the courthouse, they have a statue of Dred Scott and his wife out there. And just wondering, how long it's been there, and who was involved with help getting that statue erected outside of the courthouse,
Freddie,
old courthouse?
That's an excellent question. I'm going to let Lynn answer that. Lynn, go ahead.
Oh, you know the answer, Barbara.
Yes.
I'm very happy. Thank you, Freddie, for that question. It's very, very exciting for me to tell you that I am the person behind the statue.
Yes.
When we started the foundation in 2006, the anniversary of the decision was in 2007, and I only had two goals. Not thinking I'd still be doing this 14 years later, but I actually felt that since there was no statue anywhere in the whole world of him, that was a tragedy. So that was a goal, and we actually raised $250,000 to install the statue of Dred and Harriet. And thank you for acknowledging it and appreciating it, because it is the only one in the world right now. And so that was like a personal thing for me in my heart. But, the foundation gave me the opportunity to ask the public to help. And I will say that it was pretty much done with just private donations, not really corporations or anything like that. We had one donor that was extremely generous and remained anonymous. But beyond that, it was that. And we had a penny drive. We had a penny drive to involve young people and to get the story out as an educational opportunity. And believe it or not, I didn't know I had a few naysayers, but they were quiet until it was over. They acknowledged they didn't think it was going to work, but we raised almost $50,000 just through the penny drive.
Wow, that's incredible, because you brought in the young people and they actually had buy-in to this.
Absolutely. And when they would raise more than $500, I would take a plaque out there to their school that had the Dred Scott on a penny that I created. And a 3-inch coin, it really was it's a heavy thing. In fact, we use it now for an award. It's very nice. Lincoln's on the other side. And so every school that raised $500 or more received that plaque. Well, it actually was encased, but very nice award. And it was exciting. It was very exciting. But, yeah, it's very beautiful, and thank you for asking about it.
So you two will be here on Tuesday, January 21st, from 7 until 8:30 p.m. This is in honor of National Day of Racial Healing. And this event is being sponsored by the Hampton Roads Community Foundation in partnership with Norfolk State University, Old Dominion University, and Virginians for Reconciliation. So to both of you, what do you hope comes out of the discussion on Tuesday night? Let me start with you, Lynn, and then we'll go to you, Hank.
Well, we did this in Richmond last year, and the response that we received after it was just overwhelmingly beautiful. I hope that people will come away, because this time we will have Plessy and Ferguson with us, seeing how people today can look at who we are, what we need to be doing, and what we want to build for the future. And hopefully they'll see that vision and join in their own ways. Sometimes Charlie and I, we have a couple of program ideas that we share with people to let them know that, this is not difficult. Here's a very simple way that you can go out with just one person and make a difference. And those are seeds that are sown, and we need a new crop, and that crop is it's gonna flourish.
Can you share one of those ideas with my audience to let them know of, if they can't come, there's still some things that you can do in order to try to eliminate this racial divide?
Oh, yeah. One of them is what we call breaking bread, and it's simply a person of one race inviting a person of another race. And sometimes you need to be introduced, because there are situations where some of our white friends have never been in a social setting or lived in a neighborhood, gone to a school with any black people. You wouldn't think that's true, but it still is. And so they may need to be introduced to someone or by someone who feels like these are two people I think could get along. Otherwise, find somebody on your own, but just have that coffee and just sit down and just get to know each other. It's kind of like my soapbox. Is like,
okay.
Yeah.
Hank, what do you're the moderator for this illustrious panel, and I know you're going to have a great time with them, but what do you hope comes out of this?
I hope people think a little bit more about history, and they think about how history plays into today, and how we, in some ways, can make our own history in some respects. Lynn noted what's going on in St. Louis, and it's really interesting. I actually spent about a decade in Columbia, Missouri, teaching law out there, and St. Louis is a very interesting town. Of course, no doubt. In some ways, people want to remember. In some ways, they want to forget. So if you're standing by the Dred Scott statue, you also can see, depending on what direction you're looking in, you can see the Gateway Arch, right? So everyone loves to remember Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark, they were awesome, right? But folks want to forget that you had Dred Scott and that decision, 40 years later. So the freedom that folks think about with Lewis and Clark, the fact that two guys just got up and said, "Let me just go explore this country for Thomas Jefferson," that kind of freedom was right next to a situation where you had somebody who was in bondage. So in some ways we want to remember, in some ways we want to forget. I hope that people come with open hearts and open minds, and I hope they're honest about what they see, because it's going to be very hard to reconcile in any real way unless we're first honest. So I hope we're honest about our history, and that we're honest about our present, and we can be really honest about our future.
Sure. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Henry joins us from Hampton. Hi, Henry. You're on the air.
Hi. This is Henry Chambers. So, Dr. Chambers, good to hear my name talked around. Fabulous. I was like, oh, is that what it would sound like? My question is about current day laws and regulations, especially in Virginia. But it pertains to my daughters now working for the ACLU, and one of their big things is identification, facial recognition software and uses, and how it's very badly skewed against people of color. And I didn't know if there was anything like that coming around in Virginia, or you're active in anything, or something we should be paying attention to.
we ought to be paying attention to everything when it comes to technology. To be perfectly honest, now I'm goodness knows I'm pro technology. I like the concept of technology. That's great, but we have to be careful with how we use it. Those folks who think that technology is always a positive and an unalloyed positive aren't necessarily always right. So I think one of the things that we're talking about in terms of facial recognition is that it does not do a terribly good job with folks of color. So it can misidentify folks of color, and that can be very dangerous if folks assume that an identification is correct, particularly if an individual who is identified is thought to have done something untoward. So unquestionably, we need to continue to keep our eye on technology and all kinds of things that may have differential effects on some groups versus others. Boy, that Henry Chambers, he's brilliant.
And that Henry Chambers, how about that?
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for calling, Henry. We appreciate that. So, Lynne and Henry, I'm going to ask both of you this question because here at Another View, we do community conversations. We call them Race Let's Talk About It. And we go out into the community and bring up issues and let the community drive the conversation. But I hear a lot from people who say, I'm tired of talking, I want to do something. And I want to get from the two of you, have we talked enough yet? Or is there a way to combine talking with action so that people feel that they're actually making a difference? Lynne, what do you think?
Yeah, actually, I do. I'm very much a doer. The Bible says, "Don't just be hearers of the word, but be doers." Mm-hmm. And I think we've been talking since Michael Brown, horrifically much more than even before. But that was 6 years ago, and we can't talk forever. I think, for instance, in my situation, if people hear what I'm doing and find out that this is a good thing, then join. Ask how you can help. Volunteer. We always need help. We don't have a staff per se at all. You're listening to her, but yeah, just find something that grabs your heart and get involved, because talk is cheap. And after a while, it's like, yeah, we heard that already. Or you'll see a program idea and another program. It'll be like the same agenda. Like, okay, have we come to some conclusions? Mm-hmm. So, and if you have special skills in mediation and things like that, form your own group. I formed my own foundation. I didn't know I was going to do this.
This is your calling.
Yeah, it's one of them. It's one of them. They do at least overlap, I'll say that. But yeah, and we're all here for a purpose. And that's the key to all of this. Find your purpose and why you're here, and it's usually going to be right there where your gifts are, what you're drawn to, whatever that is. For instance, was with somebody not long ago, and they were saying, even today, I do well in the background. We need background people. Mm-hmm. Everybody can't be out front. Everybody's not supposed to be
that's where the work gets done, in the background.
It is. It's worker bees. We all need worker bees. Thank you. And I'm not trying to even be out in the front, but it's just that's the way it has to be. Yeah. So, definitely I think we've talked. But we can continue to talk, though. I don't think everybody's been listening, or they maybe haven't heard the best message or the one that rings for them. Mm-hmm. But along with that, let's get busy. We must be about our Father's business.
But, Henry, let me ask you this then, Hank. How do we get the people who need to hear the message the most? Because I think you start with the folks who get it, in quotes, who are already there or who recognize that we need to make a change and that things need to be different. But how do we reach those who are still either sitting on the fence or on the opposite side of the fence, who say, you know what, leave this alone?
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult situation. Let me note that I think that we don't quite talk enough. Now, okay. I agree with you that talk can be cheap. But here's part of my problem is when somebody says something that's just flat out wrong, mm-hmm. sometimes we just sort of let it go. Mm-hmm. Well, this is a time where I'm not talking about being aggressive, but where it's reasonable just to say, gosh, help me understand where you're coming from. I don't necessarily mean calling them out and saying that they're wrong, but just help me understand where you're coming from on that particular issue. more talk sometimes works rather than less talk on some of these particular issues, as long as we come in with an open mind and an open heart. Some of it also is how we talk about things. So, for example, and I'm not calling anybody out in any respects along these lines, but when we ask folks, where are you from, and what's your neighborhood? And I know, Lynn, particularly if you grew up in St. Louis, you know that this happens in St. Louis all the time, where folks ask, where'd you go to high school? They're looking for information to separate themselves from you or to adhere you to them. Part of the question is, why are we asking those questions as opposed to where you grew up? Where are you going, and how can we get there together? You know, when we think about supposed bad neighborhoods, what does that mean, and why do we allow that to continue? We can ask our elected officials, if you think you know where the bad neighborhoods are, whatever that means, how are you going to fix them so that they're not bad anymore and so that they are all part of the city that we all call home? Issues along those lines. Part of it is recognizing that we're all in this together. Regardless of what may have happened 100 years ago, which we should never forget, we are also in this together, and our job is to look forward to make sure that we're building a better world for our children and our grandchildren. That's our responsibility, and we've got to do that. And if that means we got to talk, we got to talk. If it means we got to do stuff, we got to do stuff. But it does mean that what we're not allowed to do is sit on the sidelines. So everybody's got to come out, pull their oar, and move this thing forward.
Well, I tell you, I think that the whole idea of Lynn meeting you on the phone, I'm sure that Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson and Charles Taney, all of you have made up in your minds that bitterness is not the answer, but that coming together is the answer. And
right, and respect each other.
Yeah, and respect for each other, which for some people is a really hard place to get to.
Yeah, I realize that it is. You know, I had an opportunity not long ago to be very distraught about something that some people had done, not so much to me, but it gave me a little bit of a feeling about being angry and like how people don't want to forgive. And I'm a very forgiving person. But I just had that little glimpse given to me for a moment where and by a moment I mean a few weeks actually, but I really had to ask myself, okay, I'm a little more forgiving because of who I am, but what about that person who just doesn't have that bent, and we're asking them to try to do that? This is how they feel. I'm not happy about this situation, and now I'm feeling a little bit more about how they might feel about this situation, about race or whatever. So, yeah, so I was able to put myself in there. But here's what I found out. I found out that it only hurt me to stay angry.
Yes.
It literally can make you sick. Your mind gets cloudy and foggy, and I have a very clear mind most of the time myself. But it just takes you down, and then all of a sudden you're not you anymore. So don't hold on to that anger. But what I've done, and I don't get angry easily or very often, but turn that into something productive.
Well, Lynn Jackson and Henry Chambers Jr. will be here in Hampton Roads on the 21st from 7 to 8:30 p.m. at the L. Douglas Wilder Performing Arts Center at Norfolk State University. Thank you guys so much for joining me today on the show. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to meeting both of you when you come to town.
Thank you.
All right, you all take care. Okay. And the Black National Anthem, also known as Lift Every Voice and Sing, has been arranged numerous times by dozens of composers. But when James Cockerham took it on, this multifaceted musician decided he wanted to take listeners on a journey from the old world to the new. He recently shared his thoughts with our Lisa Godley, as well as his excitement that the Virginia Symphony Orchestra will be playing his version of the song in the upcoming Songs for a Dreamer celebration.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring.
These powerful words tell the story of a people used, mistreated, and abused for almost 250 years. A people who, once freed, would battle legalized racial segregation for another 100 years. The words depicting their struggle for their basic human rights started out as a poem written by James Weldon Johnson. And by 1919, the NAACP would name Lift Every Voice and Sing the Negro National Anthem.
Loud as the rolling sea.
Since that time, Lift Every Voice and Sing has been recorded by various artists and arranged numerous times by different composers. When songwriter-composer James Cockerham was asked to compose an arrangement for orchestra, he knew he wanted his version to start with the sounds of Africa.
Imagine the sounds of percussive instruments being heard from a distance while standing in the middle of a forest. Drums and a tambourine play a 12/8 African rhythm. That distant rhythm repeats itself over and over again, but it is quiet at the top of the mountain. Listen. The low hum of strings can now be heard like a sound from the earth in rotation. The sounds grow louder as woodwinds mimic birds singing. The melodies are the same ones heard when windows are opened in springtime. The beautiful scenery of Africa is seamless and endless, but there are more chapters in this history book.
Cockerham says what he envisioned next was the ship that brought our ancestors to America. He says it wasn't a pleasant journey, and the music would need to reflect that.
Chained together, they are on a ship where urinating, defecating, eating, and drinking all take place in the same small space. Crying, angry outbursts, and pleas for help in many different languages are heard and understood. Soon, they will be sold as slaves.
Cockerham introduces a string quartet to indicate the arrival of the first Africans in 1619. And to symbolize decades and then centuries passing, he incorporates a blues and jazz line, showcasing the creation of new music styles.
What took you from writing to arranging songs that had been written by other composers?
Growing up, we couldn't afford piano lessons. I borrowed my cousin's John Thompson Easy Step books and taught myself to play piano. It's just been a learning experience. And I can remember at my third album, I let my former high school band director, Dr. Graham, listen to it, and he was saying, "Boy, what is this?" He said, "The way you structured these chords, I could never write anything like that. My teaching would not allow me to do this." I said, "What? Should I change it?" He said, "No, don't change anything. It's great." So he's been an inspiration to me to keep writing.
6 albums, 4 CDs, and 4 musical stage productions later, James Cockerham's composing skills remain in high demand. He says he's still looking for some movies to score and is extremely excited about a social consciousness project he's working on with his son that's slated for later this year. As for his thoughts on one of the country's most recognizable socially conscious songs,
the words are as relevant to African Americans today as they were in 1900. The descendants of the Africans brought to America should indeed continue to lift every voice and sing.
For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
The Songs for a Dreamer concert is free and open to the public and will take place on this Sunday, January 19th at 7 at Norfolk's Booker T. Washington High School. Next week on Another View, Alice, what its poverty looks like on the peninsula and what they are doing about it. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer, and Todd Washburn is our audio engineer. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Thank you so very, very much for listening to Another View.